the first chapter of the third book of the Discourses on Living. This chapter, which provides Machiavelli's most extended treatment of the subject, opens with a discussion of the renewal of republics and the necessity of such a renewal in order to extend the longevity of the state. Those worldly things, which are republics and principalities, which, quote, go the whole course that is ordered for them by heaven, are those that do not disorder their body, but keep it ordered, so that either it does not alter, or if it alters, it is for its safety and not its harm. Machiavelli goes on to comment that because I am speaking of mixed bodies, such as republics and sects, I say that those alterations are for safety that lead them back towards their beginnings. The safety of what Machiavelli calls mixed bodies, which includes republics, sects, and eventually also kingdoms, requires drawing those regimes back to their beginnings. For, quote, all the beginnings of sects, republics, and kingdoms must have some goodness in them, by means of which they may regain their first reputation and their first increase. Because in the process of time, that goodness is corrupted, unless something intervenes to lead it back to the mark, it of necessity kills that body. It is the virtue that a state had at its founding that gave that state its strength. And as time progresses, and the moment of that founding becomes more distant and the memory hazier, that virtue is lost, becoming corrupted by the passing of time. Recalling this memory to mind, then, is necessary to restore that lost virtue, which is in turn necessary for a state to survive. Machiavelli writes that, speaking of republics, this return towards the beginning is done through either extrinsic accident or intrinsic prudence. As to the first, one sees that it was necessary that Rome be taken by the French if one wished that it be reborn, and if by being reborn, regain the observance of religion and justice, which were beginning to be tainted in it. Machiavelli's reference to the Gauls' sacking of Rome, the French taking the city, as necessary for Roman rebirth, begins to introduce the usefulness of violence in renewing a state, though in this case, violence brought on from an external source. The crisis within Roman politics brought on by the fall of their city to the Gauls, what Machiavelli will call an external beating, revealed to the Romans that it was necessary not only to maintain religion and justice, but also to esteem its good citizens and to take more account of their virtue than those advantages that it appeared to them they lacked through their works. As a result, as soon as the city was retaken from the Gauls, the Romans, quote, renewed all the orders of their ancient religion as a means to regain the strength that they had had under the orders established by their kings. This points to the benefit Machiavelli sees in crisis, spurring on the need for a renewal of modes and orders that have been corrupted over time. He writes that it is thus necessary, as was said, that men who live together in any order, whatever, often examine themselves through these extrinsic accidents or through intrinsic ones. Given then the necessity of such examinations for restoring and renewing a state, a prudent prince would not wish to be forced to rely only on accident, but would rather seek to order and govern their state in such a way that these renewals would be prearranged. And indeed, you'll see Machiavelli counsels that they should occur frequently, as the more distant the memory either of the founding virtue of their most recent restoration become. Machiavelli contends that this good, intrinsic events that bring about examination or renewal within a state emerge either through the virtue of a man or through the virtue of an order. But after giving examples of institutions and laws in Rome that promoted Machiavellian virtue, goes on to comment that such orders have need of being brought to life by the virtue of a citizen who rushes spiritedly to execute them against the power of those who transgress them. Even in a state with good orders, then, renewal ultimately relies on single individuals willing to act on those orders. Further, Machiavelli demonstrates that he does not employ the word execute lightly, as the examples he offers for citizens rushing spiritedly to execute virtuous orders are the quite literal executions of Romans who would transgress the laws. And he comments of these executions that because they were excessive and notable, such things made men draw back towards the mark whenever one of them arose. Beyond again emphasizing the role of violence in drawing a state back to its original strength, then, this argument also elevates the role of a single energetic citizen over the institutional role of laws and orders. In addition to his Roman examples, Machiavelli also offers an example contemporary to his own time, pointing to the practices of the Florentine Medici family. He writes that those who governed the state of Florence from 1434 up to 1494 through the Medici, used to say to this purpose that it was necessary to regain the state every 5 years, Otherwise, it was difficult to maintain it. A planned regaining of the state, then, would seem to accord with Machiavelli's earlier observation that frequent renewals of the state is required, and that a prudent prince will arrange for such renewal to occur. Machiavelli further clarifies what the Medici meant by regaining the state, writing that they called regaining the state putting that terror and that fear in men that had been put there and taking it, since at that time they had beaten down those who, according to that mode of life, had worked for ill. Recalling to mind Machiavelli's teaching in The Prince on the utility of fear, the Medici regularly inspired in the citizens of Florence that terror that they had felt when the Medici took control of the city, employing violence to restore and renew their hold over the Florentine people. A frequent return to violence is also necessary, for as the memory of the beatings is eliminated, men begin to dare to try new things and to say evil, and so it is necessary to provide for it, drawing the state back towards its beginnings. Alongside the baseline need for violence in some form to draw a state back to its beginnings and thereby restore its virtue, Machiavelli emphasizes that this restorative violence can, and moreover ought to be, planned by a prudent statesman. Though accident can bring about such a restoration, with Machiavelli pointing to the example of the Gauls' sack of Rome, intrinsic prudence can also be employed, indicating the ability to prearrange such restorative events. Further, given Machiavelli's emphasis on the necessity of such renewals, it is fairly straightforward to conclude that he would endorse a wise prince arranging events in such a way as to bring about the necessity for restorative violence. His example of the Medici regaining the state further supports this conclusion, as the Medicis planned out their regaining of the state, and in Machiavelli's telling had even developed their own precursor to Machiavelli's own thinking on the need to restore and rejuvenate states through violence. In addition, as Machiavelli observes in The Prince, a wise statesman does not rely on fortune in the governance of his state, but rather makes dams and dikes through his own virtue in order to restrain fortune and provide for his own success. It would seem then that Machiavelli advises his reader not to rely on fortune to restore a state which is grown corrupted, or certainly not only fortune, but rather to act upon his own virtue to restore the state to its ancient virtue. In order to restore a corrupted state, Machiavelli argues, it is necessary to draw that state back to its first principles, to its founding. The principal mode for attempting such a renewal in Machiavelli's schema is violence, pointing to the Gauls' sack of Rome and the Medici's planned regaining of the state as examples. Through violence and the terror that violence can inspire, the modes and orders a state had at its founding, modes and orders Machiavelli contends will be stronger than later corrupted modes, can be rejuvenated, and virtue and strength returns to the people and their state. Bloodshed then takes on a restorative character in Machiavelli's thought, providing a source of renewal and strength to a once weak and decayed state and people.
Lee, will you go next?
Sure, thank you. So my paper is what core texts can learn from political science. So this is, last year I had an article on what political science can learn from core texts. So I thought I'd reverse the causal arrow this time. In book 4, chapter 1 of the Politics, Aristotle categorizes the study of regimes into 4 types: the best regime per se; second, the best regime according to circumstances; third, the best regime based on a supposition; and fourth, the best regime for all cities. These 4 types of regimes correspond to the 4 traditional subfields in political science. The best regime per se corresponds to political theory; the best regime according to circumstances, to comparative politics; the best regime based on a supposition, American politics, or the politics of a specific locality; and the best regime for all cities, to international relations. These 4 traditional subfields, political theory, comparative politics, American politics, and international relations, can provide a template to analyze texts. If we see texts as a type of regimes, then the political scientist could illuminate first, what are the claims made and should be made about a text, the realm of political theory? Second, what claims are made according to the specific circumstances portrayed in the text, comparative politics? Third, what claims are made under a certain supposition, American politics? And fourth, what claims are made universally, international relations? The political scientist therefore can make evaluations of a text in a manner that constructs knowledge. An example from Tolstoy's War and Peace will show how this is accomplished. In the second epilogue, Tolstoy explains his philosophy of history, that historians should reject the model of natural science and instead focus on how freedom, the manifestation of God and human consciousness, asserts itself in the world. This claim is not only about reality, but more importantly, how we should read War and Peace. It is a claim of political theory about the best regime per se. According to Tolstoy, the reader should not be preoccupied with the externalities of time, space, and causality, but rather examine the interior consciousness of characters and how they touch or fall short of divine grace. If this is the guiding normative principle of War and Peace, the reader can move to the paradigms of comparative politics, American politics, and international relations to understand other claims made in the text. A comparative approach would examine claims made by different characters, or even the same character, and detail the circumstances of each character to better understand their claims. For instance, Andre's claim that life is to seek eternal fame in battle. The circumstances is, when he made this claim, is when he was young, married, and was bored with life. This claim can be compared to later when he argues that life is nothing more than to live simply and do no harm after a different set of circumstances when his wife has died in childbirth. And these claims can be compared to Pierre's acceptance of the mystery that both good and evil exist in life. So instead of accumulating claim after claim, the political scientist can then situate each claim to the author's normative claim, as in this case with Tolstoy's philosophy of history, to see which character comes closer or farther from it. With regard to American politics and international relations, the political scientist can examine the supposition of the claims made by characters. For example, Andre's desire for eternal fame in battle presupposes that there's no afterlife, and therefore all that matters is what is to be remembered temporally. Likewise, Pierre's eventual acceptance of the mystery of existence assumes epistemological limitations why both good and evil exist in the world. After examining these suppositions for each claim, the political scientist can determine the feasibility of which one is most universal in the text. In this instance, Pierre's claims are more universal than Andre's, not only because he survives at the end of the novel, but his normative claims corresponds closer to Tolstoy's. This is not to say the political scientist must agree with Pierre's universal claim. All the political scientist is doing is to see which claim or claims is most universal in the text. In this brief exercise, I've shown how the political scientist can use Aristotle's regimes, political theory, comparative politics, American politics, and international relations to analyze characters' claims in War and Peace. An examination of a normative claim about the text, comparing claims by characters and understanding their circumstances, an analysis of the supposition of these claims, and the determination which claim is most universal. This mode of analysis can also be extended to regimes themselves, such as Napoleonic France or Alexander's Russia, as well as to the author's own circumstances and presuppositions. Further area of research could be adoption of the most current subfields in political science to analyze tests such as public policy or public administration. Another venue to explore is to examine the various schools of thought within a subfield, such as the schools of realism or constructivism in international relations. As knowledge becomes more specialized in the academy, dialogue among disciplines has become more distant. There's a great deal that the social sciences can learn from the humanities. Likewise, the humanities can learn a great deal from the social sciences. Whether this template of Aristotle works for better understanding of text, therefore, is secondary to the attempt at dialogue between the humanities and social sciences. I hope that this essay is one of the many first steps in this attempt.
Thank you. As I said, if you have a question or a comment, let me know in the chat and we'll get to all of those in order after the papers are complete. And this is my turn. Slightly retitled my paper, Tyranny and Wisdom in the Age of COVID. In reflecting on how issues connected with the COVID pandemic can be addressed in the liberal arts or core text classroom, we can take two approaches. One is to use contemporary issues and concerns to illuminate the so-called classic texts we're teaching. The other is to use those so-called classic texts to shed light on those contemporary issues and concerns. In the one case, we find the familiar in what is ostensibly remote or foreign. In the other case, we problematize or make strange what seems to be familiar. I don't mean to suggest that these two approaches are necessarily mutually exclusive or that only one and not the other has a place in our cortex pedagogy. In many cases, we might stress one aspect or the other, depending upon whether we are attempting to make our students comfortable with a seemingly alien text or trying to offer a new and distinctive perspective on a contemporary problem or issue on which we think we might have an angle. I propose to illuminate these different approaches to examining a few texts that I taught earlier this semester. Xenophon's Hero, a dialogue between the wise poet Simonides and Hiero, the tyrant of Syracuse, and commentaries on that dialogue by Leo Strauss and Alexander Kojève. Let me begin by sketching a scenario that was quite common in the past year, for which our ordinary political language and categories, at least so far as they are in the US, are not altogether adequate, if not wholly inadequate. There is an expert, let's call him Dr. Fauci, who tells us that in order to be safe as possible during the pandemic, we must wear at least 2 masks, maintain social distancing, and refrain from even attending moderate-sized social gatherings, and lately, obviously, get vaccinated. On the basis of advice like this, which change from time to time for a variety of reasons, many state and local jurisdictions issued orders with the force of law closing many schools, churches, and businesses. I do not need to assess the niceties of the constitutional sources of state and local authority to issue such orders, nor do I need to assess the competing claims of experts in different fields, for example, public health and epidemiology, economics, politics, psychology. My point is that in the past year, perhaps the most frequently cited basis for a claim to limit the freedom of any person living in the US was science. This despite the facts that various sciences and scientists involved were not necessarily in agreement, that science itself self-consciously questions rather than establishes authority, and that many of those who were citing science as the ground of their orders were very likely ill-equipped critically to assess and affirm the claims of the science on whom they were basing their orders. I could make use of Aristotle's Politics to state this point in a different way. As they learn more, what scientists recommend changes, but quote unquote science-based change is not necessarily good for law or the rule of law. Aristotle tells us in Book 2 of the Politics, change in an art is not like change in law, for law has no strength with respect to obedience apart from habit, and this is not created except over a period of time. Hence, the easy alteration of existing laws in favor of new and different laws weakens the power of law itself. In other words, what procures and sustains acquiescence in and obedience to law is habit, not full rational understanding and consent, so says Aristotle. When we obey the law, we do not assess de novo its rationality, truth, i.e. its foundation in a scientific understanding of the subject it purports to address, or justice, but for the most part accept it as something we have always done, as an apparently constant and unalterable part of the environment in which we live. To be sure, one could respond that our framework of consent, if you will, informed consent, might be sufficient to address the concern I've raised. We all know enough, someone might say, to give or withhold our consent. Perhaps all we need is Thomas Hobbes's claim in Leviathan, that, as he puts it, a plain husbandman is more prudent in affairs of his own house than a privy councillor is in the affairs of another man. Each of us knows enough to think for and govern himself or herself, so that there are, as Hobbes puts it, very few so foolish that had rather not govern themselves than be governed by others. Of course, I've chosen passages from Hobbes that could be deployed on both, or should I say all sides of the argument. Yes, we might be said to know enough to judge for ourselves and hence be capable of giving consent. But this is precisely the kind of argument that Hobbes deploys against claims to know better than we do what's good for us. Why should Dr. Fauci or a state or local official who follows him tell me how to protect my health? An appropriate response could be that the complexity of responding appropriately to a deadly pandemic goes far beyond our capacity for prudence in the affairs of our own household. A news report late last year captures the problem quite nicely. In an interview with the New York Times, Dr. Fauci admitted that he'd been changing his estimate of the level of herd immunity required to contain the virus, and here I'm quoting from the report, partly based on new science and partly on his gut feeling that the country is finally ready to hear what he really thinks. Scientific judgments and conclusions change, and the general public may not in any event be able to accept and acquiesce in those judgments and conclusions. Note that part of the basis for how he invokes scientific authority is not itself scientific, but as he puts it, a gut feeling, which is at best perhaps prudential judgment, either not at all susceptible to scientific testing or testable only in a way that defeats the purpose of exercising political judgments. In other words, in politics, we may have to act before we have certainty regarding the result. That's a scientific experiment, but one should not experiment, so to speak, on large populations when life and death are at stake. These considerations finally bring me to Xenophon Strauss and Kojève. Xenophon's Hero presents, as I said, a conversation between what one scholar has termed a garden variety tyrant and a visiting poet reputed to be wise. Hero, the tyrant, is suspicious of wise people because, as he puts it, they might contrive something. And that for him means something not good for my continued tyranny. As a guest in Hero's court, Simonides, the wise poet, is potentially at the tyrant's mercy. This setting, with its disproportion between wisdom and political power, is not unusual in classical political thought. And I could here offer a number of examples from Plato's Republic, but I'll skip that. In brief, classical political philosophy problematizes the connection between knowledge or wisdom and political power. If good government requires both wisdom and consent, it is not clear that wisdom by itself will ordinarily procure consent, or that those who have the capacity to deploy force will be wise or even listen to wisdom. Xenophon's dialogue shows how Simonides can manipulate Hero into talking himself into listening to the poet's advice, which is still a far cry from actually conducting himself in accordance with it. In his commentary, Strauss describes the consequence of the reform Simonides proposes to his anxious, tyrannical host. Tyranny at its best, Strauss says, tyranny as corrected according to Simonides' suggestions, is no longer rule over unwilling subjects. It is most certainly rule over willing subjects, but it remains rule not according to laws, i.e. is absolute government. Simonides, who extols tyranny at its best, refrains from using the very term law. Tyranny is essentially rule without laws, or more precisely, monarchic rule without laws. Wisdom and political authority seem here to have been brought together. The unwise tyrant gets what he wants, his subjects get what they want, and the wise advisor apparently gets what he wants. To be sure, it's worth inquiring what exactly each party of the arrangement gets. The tyrant, who desires to be loved by human beings, apparently gains a way of winning that love. In the arrangement Simonides proposes, the subjects receive honors for providing things useful to the city and, quote, the leisure to concern themselves with their private property, unquote. They are not real men, andres in Greek, but merely human beings, anthropoi, since they do not strive for the great things that can be won by means of political power. They do not compete with the tyrant. The subjects do not change their behavior, save perhaps those who participate in the contest for honors from the tyrant, but are simply no longer rendered insecure by the tyrant's actions. It's not clear what the wise person gets, save perhaps the acquiescence on everyone's part that he or she be able to continue in his or her pursuits. Stated another way, and very briefly here, the role of wisdom in politics as exemplified in the Hero is in this case not transformative. The ends people pursue remain essentially the same. All that changes, and only for the tyrant, is the means of gaining satisfaction, which are rendered more consistent with the ends the subjects pursue. The place of knowledge or wisdom in such a political order is in effect behind the scenes, out of public view. Neither the tyrant nor the people become wise as a result of the intervention of the wise advisor. The role of wisdom here is for the most part instrumental and hence invisible. If wisdom has ends of its own, they are satisfied outside the political arena. Now, Alexander Kojève, the great left Hegelian, in his response to Strauss's commentary on Xenophon's dialogue, insists that there, as I'm quoting here, there is in principle no difference whatsoever between the statesman and the philosopher. Both seek recognition and both act with a view to deserving it. I do not wish to rehearse here the entire argument that on which this claim rests, but I will stress 2 points. First, while Strauss distinguishes the love the tyrant seeks and the admiration the philosopher seeks, Kojève asserts that both seek admiration. Their ends are essentially the same. Second, Kojève argues that wisdom can only be sought and found by means of action in the public world, by means of politics, in other words. Epicurean inaction or withdrawal or mere personal non-dialogical or private contemplation is, in Kojève's view, a cul-de-sac of sectarianism. What the philosopher wants, he or she can only attain through political action. And if it succeeds, this action culminates in the universal recognition of the philosopher's wisdom, which implies that the action has to be transformative. It has to create an enlightened public capable of recognizing the wisdom and hence the authority of the philosopher. Science has to rule in its own name. I've said enough in this brief paper to begin to show how this debate illuminates our current political circumstances. To begin with, there are multiple and competing claims of scientific authority to deal with the problems associated with the COVID pandemic. While competing claims to know might in some circumstances lead to epistemic modesty on the part of the claimants and to a kind of tolerant pluralism, leaving individuals to assess the claims for themselves to the degree that they can, those who make such claims typically brook no opposition and are willing and able to use the power of the state to carry out their views. They are self-consciously in the position of the wise dealing with apparently the unwise, or maybe the future wise. The treatment of the subject in On Tyranny affords us 2 options. The wise could conceal their distinctive wisdom from the public, simply offering advice behind the scenes so that both political actors and the general public could achieve their otherwise ordinary and typical goals. Or the wise could openly assert their authority, presuming a receptive public or actively creating a receptive public. We're certainly not in the situation where the wise are operating behind the scenes. Science is openly asserting its authority. Much of the evidence, both out of Dr. Fauci's mouth and from surveys of mask shutdown and vaccine resistance, suggests that we do not at the moment have a public simply and wholly receptive to the claims purporting to rest on science. The issue then is, how do we go about creating a public that will acquiesce in the rule of the wise? The most commonplace answer is enlightenment or education, which seems reassuring because it seems peaceful, non-coercive, and ultimately consensual. The more we learn and know, the more we should be capable of acknowledging the wise as wise. Result, Kojève says, that will satisfy both them and us. I'll return to this in a moment after I've discussed the other alternative. The wise can rule the unwise without their consent, that is, coercively. If one is, so to speak, in a hurry to achieve one's wise goals, one has to have recourse to tyranny, as Kojève hints and then openly admits in his essay on tyranny and wisdom. The question is whether this coercion is a permanent condition of the relationship between the wise and the unwise, or a transitional phase involving the use of force until the hitherto unwise public learns enough to consent. In the latter case, we see the iron fist potentially inside the velvet glove of the aforementioned enlightenment. You will be enlightened whether you like it or not. When wisdom deals with unwisdom, the initial relationship cannot simply be discursive, or as we would now say, transparent. The options open to the wise are either rhetorical, clothing one's novel truths in traditional garb, or coercive. In either case, do they comport with the notion of informed consent or enlightenment simply. These reflections on tyranny and wisdom in their ancient and modern forms, I think, clarify some issues for us. We have to confront squarely the question of how responsibly to bring knowledge into the public sphere, how comfortable we are with asserting knowledge as the basis of authority, and how likely it is that knowledge will prevail on its own terms through education, discourse, and persuasion. If our knowledge is in fact not complete and perfect wisdom, if we, or some of us, are at best becoming wise, how are we to think about our authority? If the unwise, as has been said of the poor, will always be with us, how does that affect our judgment of the means at hand? Does it make us more or less willing to avail ourselves of tyrannical power, the power to rule coercively without the consent of the governed? These issues are not as easily raised on the basis of typical Enlightenment texts, in large measure because those texts tend to discount and conceal the problematical character of the goal, and because they look away from the recourse to coercion that is always close to the surface in the ancient consideration of tyranny and wisdom. I will not insist that the texts included on tyranny are the only way to call these questions to our attention, but their sophistication and frankness have enabled me to put them in bold relief, these questions, that is, for my students. Returning in conclusion to my introductory comments about the relationship between classic texts and contemporary issues, the example of public health expertise in this age of pandemic offers a hook to provoke students into thinking about wisdom and tyranny. So the text illuminates the current thinking, and the current issue helps them see how the text actually can speak to them. These timeless reflections help us see further and deeper than if we were simply discussing current events where partisanship and self-interest might distract us from the fundamental issue. Thank you so much. So now there's an opportunity for comments or questions from members of the audience or from the panelists. I've said, let me know in the chat, but this group is, I think, actually small enough that we can just, let's see, do we have, yes, there's a raise hand function under reaction. So just raise your hand and I'll call on you. Well, since no one, oh, Lee, go ahead.
Yep, thank you. I'm just going to lower my hand. So I enjoyed both papers. I just had some thoughts to share for maybe the prompt discussion with the group. So with Dennis's paper, I was wondering if you could, you mentioned you're examining violence as a sort of a way of restorative renewal for Machiavelli. But Machiavelli also writes in his writings too about ways to renew a polity without violence, right? So he mentions, for example, right, the introduction of censorship and the introduction of the plebeians coming to power as a way, as institutional mechanisms to renew a polity. Or so I was wondering if you could maybe speak of that relationship of that. The different ways to renew a polity. One is certainly by violence, but there's also non-violent mechanism that Machiavelli suggests to renew a polity. Second point I had was, I was wondering if you could speak maybe a little bit more on violence. You talk about restorative violence as a restorative feature, but really Machiavelli talks about, at least what I remember, he talks about violence the most as the founding of a regime in a lot of ways. So I wonder if there's the difference between the use of violence in founding a regime versus restoring or renewing a regime. And then third, Machiavelli also talks about violence in a way of resistance, right? And so when you read the Florentine histories, right, he talks about the plebeians use violence to resist the tyrants in that way. So and that's a case where you see Machiavelli using violence not in the restorative sense, but actually in the conservative sense, sort of maintain the regime. So those were just my three thoughts on your paper. And then with Joe's paper, I think it raises a broader question, which is really that we're wrestling with today, right? It is the question of democracy. In a democracy, what's the role of expertise? Right, and sort of it sort of reminded me of Tocqueville's observation of the equality of condition in the regime, and then as the equality of condition is the defining feature of democracy. But how then do we square that with expertise, and how do we have expertise sort of gain legitimacy in our life? And you know, what would Xenophon say about that? Yeah, I'm just not sure. I mean, I don't know how to actually connect this thought, but it just popped in my head. You know, Xenophon talks about self-control quite a bit in his dialogue. So I wonder if that might be some way to navigate in the cultivation of self-control and democracy, sort of as a way to sort of cultivate or navigate the question of equality and expertise.
Dennis, you want to take a moment to answer Lee's questions?
Yeah, sure. I'll take a stab at them. So your first question, which is on Machiavelli's treatment of nonviolent means to restore regimes. I do think there's something to that. In fact, in that chapter that I mentioned, chapter 1 of book 3, he does offer another alternative, which is sacrifice. He comments that it's the Dominicans and the Franciscans are rejuvenating Christianity through the example of the sacrifice of Christ. So he does provide this potential other alternative. I think that alternative raises two questions. One, how politically viable is sacrifice? He does, I believe, point to the example of a Roman who sacrificed, and his name is escaping me, who sacrifices himself to restore the regime, or to rejuvenate the regime. I think there is that Machiavelli offers these two alternatives, and he doesn't seem to favor one or the other. I think is interesting, and I'm not totally certain what to make of it. But it's, in either case, it does seem that some sort of violence is required, be it extrinsic or intrinsic, or external violence or internal. For example, the Dominicans and the Franciscans are taking the example of Christ's crucifixion, obviously a violent act. The Roman example, who's a man who's killed defending Rome. And to the point you raised about instituting orders, I think you mentioned the plebeians and the institution of the tribune of the plebes, which Machiavelli points to as introducing these tumults within the regime, which then strengthen it. From my reading of the text, I think Machiavelli understands the role of these restorations for when those orders fail. That these orders, that you can have these beneficial orders that strengthen a regime, but those become corrupted over time. And so something like this restorative violence is necessary, or is likely necessary in order to return back to those beneficial modes and orders. The second question was violence in foundings. And I think there, the most obvious example of this is Machiavelli's treatment of armed prophecy in what's that, chapter 6 of The Prince. And I think there, his comment on the Medici, who are, when they regain the state, they're returning, well, what's his exact phrase? Let me find that, because it's good. That they're returning, was it restoring that, putting that terror and that fear in men that had been put there and taking it. It seems here that the use of violence is to return people to that founding, to the violence that was in the founding. That, you know, and arguably it presents a sort of refounding. That by drawing the people back to the memory of that, the first founding, the founding of by the armed prophet, you return to the virtue that was necessary in order to found the state. For your third question, that was violence in a conservative sense. Is that right? Remembering? You referenced the Florentine history, which admittedly I'm not familiar with. So I can't totally speak to the context that you're referencing there. But Machiavelli does comment in the discourses that implies in certain places in the Prince that grounding a regime on the people will make it stronger than grounding on the elite. So I think that is an interesting tension that might that I would be interested to explore further. Unfortunately, I'm not super familiar with the text that you're referencing. I don't know if I have that much to say on it right now.
Let me press Dennis a little bit on his core contention, which is, you know, violence in renewing republic. He says that violence could come as it were a gift of fortune, or it could come as it were by design. That is, one could provoke the violence or embrace the violence in order to renew a regime. Now, what I want to do is try to ask you what bearing this has on our time. And the way I want to ask you that is to contemplate three, let's call them fortuitous violent moments in recent American history that maybe that are, let's say, exploitable for renewing the regime. One are the attacks on 9/11. Second would be the summer of violence, or the waves of violence in response to police killings of Black men. And the third is the attack on the Capitol on January 6th. Are these the kinds of fortuitous violence that Machiavelli has in mind? And how would Machiavelli recommend that a leader of a republic or principal political figure in a republic would use that violence to renew or restore the republic?
Sure. I think those are really interesting examples and are definitely worth considering in light of the framework of my paper and the framework that Machiavelli provides for us. I think the September 11th attack is perhaps the most easily applicable example. One, because it isn't, you had to use the word fortune to refer to a terrorist attack that killed 3,000 people, but under the Machiavellian sense of the word, it was an act of fortune. That, and arguably, then President Bush was able to use it in a way he had huge increase in popularity after the attack, was able to pass a lot of what would arguably be fairly controversial policies through, and large part is the emotional response of the terrorist attack. I think the question would be then, was it used to restore the founding virtue? There, I think you'd have to, and I think, and this is relevant for all three examples that you provided. First, you'd have to establish what one means by the founding virtue for the United States. I think that ultimately, for all three of these examples, is the question at hand. To answer the question of were they examples, could they be used to restore this founding virtue? How would Machiavelli recommend you employ them? I think is also an interesting good question. I think certainly in the case of 9/11, as I said, I think what President Bush was able to accomplish indicates that if he wasn't able to fully actualize Machiavelli's recommendations, he certainly was trending in that direction. This bolstered the support for his presidency immensely until it declined as a result of the 2008 financial crisis and other factors. I think the attack on the Capitol is perhaps an example of a failed use of violence for restorative ends, in part because depending on how if we sort of take those involved at their words, that their aim was to prevent the election of Biden and maintain Donald Trump in a second term as president, they demonstrably failed in attaining that goal because Biden is the president of the United States as we speak. So maybe an example of a failed attempt to do that. Perhaps under a Machiavellian framework, that's because it wasn't violent enough. I'm not sure. That's a kind of interesting example. And
well, can I make a suggestion, which is that when I asked the question, I was thinking less of the aims of people in the crowd or the inchoate aims of Donald Trump. I'm thinking more in part of how the violence has been portrayed to reorient or reform the republic. In other words, and if I'm not the author of the violence, but I can somehow use the violence, and I would simply say that George Bush, the rise in his popularity is one thing, but in some ways, he manifestly failed to exploit fully that violence because his big response was, let's get back to normal, which is to say shopping as quickly as possible, which is not, there was a moment where he could have perhaps sort of galvanized patriotic sentiment, and it was there, but to be a good patriot, according to George Bush, was to go back to the mall.
Right, sure.
I think his response from Machiavelli's point of view didn't go far enough, and I think in some sense all three instances of violence were not undertaken by the Machiavellian prince, but could have been in some ways, I think, exploited by a good Machiavellian Republican leader.
Although on the other hand, I think your point about Bush is salient, that his idea of sort of what is patriotism is to go shopping. But on the other hand, you also have the passage of the Patriot Act. It's a massive expansion of domestic surveillance, which is, I think, a reorientation of the regime in some way, or certainly a change in how the government and its citizens interact with one another. I don't know if it's still not perhaps a full actualization of the sort of Machiavellian moment, but there is, I think, a change is the passage of something like the passage of the Patriot Act. And there was at least in the immediate aftermath of the January 6th events discussion of extending the Patriot Act to counter far right and sort of white supremacist / nationalist terrorism. I'm admittedly not totally aware of if the sort of discussions are being moved in an actual legislative manner, but something like that would be, at least in some ways, a reorientation of the regime and a use of the regime by the government or a use of the violence by the government to reorder itself. With the Black Lives Matter protest and then the violence that was involved in those, I think also perhaps on a more domestic level, although it's somewhat unclear. Also, it certainly galvanized more progressive elements, so on the left in particular, with regards to things like police reform. I live in some of this, I think, appeared more on the local level, so it's not necessarily as again, not a full actualization of this Machiavellian moment. But so I live in Michigan, obviously Hillsdale. Ann Arbor passed a bill. The Ann Arbor City Council passed a bill that cut police funding on the grounds of these protests for their local area. So I think things like that are examples, although not full examples, because it's not a full reorientation of the regime or restoration, but they are examples of this sort of accidental violence in Machiavelli's schema being used for purposes parallel to or separate from the aims of those actually involved in the violence.
The attack on the Capitol is not the Reichstag fire, but in some ways, I think there's you can look at how people are positioning themselves vis-a-vis it to promote a particular agenda, which is in some measure a transformative agenda.
Right.
The same goes with the BLM protests on both sides. You have the the effort on the part of some conservatives to promote a kind of recovery of law and order, and you have the effort on the other side to identify what they regard as the the central ills of the American regime and to remedy them. And for both sides, I think it's a galvanizing moment. I think not. I personally am grateful that the people at the top are not reading Machiavelli and are not good at it, because I'm not confident that either transformation that I can imagine is one I'd be comfortable with. But I guess what I would suggest to you is, in teaching this or writing about this, one of the things to do is to think about bringing the text to bear to help us think through contemporary examples. Not because that's the most important thing, but you kind of see what it means as applied to, you end up living the text in a way. I'm going to try to answer Lee's question, and I'm going to offer two different answers. One is my hopeful answer, and the other is my despairing answer. My hopeful answer is can be found in Book 3, Chapter 11 of Aristotle's Politics, where Aristotle makes the case for the collective wisdom of the people, and then backs off that case, and then talks about different kinds of expertise. And there's a kind of expertise that in some ways doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense, because he talks about the craftsman, the master craftsman, and then someone who's educated with respect to an art. But if someone is educated with respect to an art is neither a craftsman nor a master craftsman, what is that person? And I suggest to my students, that's the liberally educated person who, you could jokingly say knows enough to be dangerous, but rather knows enough not to be gulled by people who talk in high tones. And Camelia, I'll get to you in just a second. So that's my hopeful answer is liberal education. My despairing answer is re-education camps. And in the name of enlightening us, we may have to be coerced. Now, we have thus far avoided the kind of re-education camps that existed in the old Soviet Union or in Pol Pot's Cambodia. But I wonder to what degree, the regime transformation that's occurring now, the enlightenment that is occurring now, is mildly coercive. And if education always is at least mildly coercive, because it's not an invitation to learn, it's you must learn. And when there is an agenda behind it, an agenda that is, alleges a kind of wisdom that we lack, we can't consent to it. We're, it's inflicted on us. We are subjected to it without our consent. So that's my hopeful is what many of us do in the liberal arts or core text classroom. My despairing answer is, the horror stories one hears about kind of coercive moral education, not only in K through 12, but on college campuses and vis-a-vis faculty. Again, it's not the gulag, and I want to maintain a kind of perspective on that. But again, I think it's helpful to think about what really is behind enlightenment other than an invitation to learn. Amelia has a question or a comment.
Yes, hi, I'm Camilla, and I'm sorry, Joseph, I didn't mean to interrupt your flow when I raised my hand. I was just trying to save my place in line, but thank you to the panelists. I'm sorry I missed the first paper. I jumped onto this late, and I only caught half of Joseph's paper, so if my question doesn't quite fit in, I apologize beforehand, but I thought I heard undertones of coercion in the paper itself, and it brought to mind this idea of violence in the state of exception, and especially in the context of a democratic response to the pandemic as being insufficient, especially in comparison with other less democratic societies. And I recently read an article that was challenging the dictum, if in doubt, risk on the side of freedom, and the title was "If in Doubt, Risk More Dictatorship," and I think it was a German author. And I was wondering if there is indeed a place for this kind of violence, of a more authoritarian response in moments of exception, and if, I don't know if your paper addressed that in any way.
I would say as a practical matter, you know, my state had, or my city had a mask mandate. So we were required to wear masks. Now, so far as I can tell, the police did not spend much of its effort in rounding up the maskless. And I think most of my fellow citizens of Brookhaven, Georgia, actually acquiesced in the exhortation. I, publicly in a local newspaper opposed the mask mandate, not because I think masks are necessarily a bad idea, but because I think if you're not going to enforce it, and you run the risk of undermining people's respect for law. And if you are going to enforce it, how much of our public safety resources are you going to use to enforce it? The response I got from people was, law has an educational function. A mandate, even a toothless mandate, offers a kind of moral suasion. I think this raises some interesting questions, and as a teacher, I think it's worth discussing these things. How much do I want to rely on coercion? If I were utterly confident that the people who were exercising the coercion knew what they were doing, I might be sort of okay with it. What impresses me more than anything else is how incompetent or only semi-competent our would-be pandemic authoritarians are, and how self-dealing in some cases they are. So I'm not convinced that the state has acquitted itself well, either in terms of, in terms of handling the pandemic. I think the kind of plurality of responses we've had in the US has been a kind of interesting, uncontrolled experiment. We can see how different jurisdictions did better or worse. We can also see how, there are some places where competence really does matter. And, the story I've heard is the most effective vaccine rollout has been Israel's. Some of the least effective are in the EU. At least in I would say in the sort of most economically advanced and developed part of the world. And U.S. states have run the gamut from pretty good to sort of okay, but in most cases better than the EU. Lee.
Yeah, I would just question the premise of the question. We don't know those regimes that have used coercion on their citizens are more effective than the regimes who have not. We can't trust the data from Russia and China, and North Korea. So it's, I mean, last I read about Russia is the actual people who have died is 3 times the official figures. So these type of states have, so to say that authoritarian regimes have used coercion, have done a better job at managing COVID than democratic regimes, we just don't know. It's not proven. Well, I mean, we just don't know what the data is not reliable. And you could look at democratic regimes that we know where the data is reliable, that have done a very good job: South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, right, which is based on freedom. So I guess I would question the premise of your inquiry.
Yes, thank you. Point well taken. I only have a very small statistical sample of one as far as first-hand knowledge. My native country of Romania has implemented fines. The government of municipal government of each particular city has made huge amounts of money out of fining people for being outside in the street without a permit. So that I know firsthand, but I don't know specifics about the others that you mentioned.
Dennis.
First, I certainly agree with everything that was previously said, but I think also something that has to be considered is, particularly when you're thinking of a democratic regime that's considering using more authoritarian methods, is in this case you're thinking about the habituation of your people to a certain kinds of rule, and I think if you're a traditional democratic regime that's turning to authoritarian methods, you're courting potentially fairly strong blowback from the people on your newly introduced authoritarian methods, ranging from, living in Michigan, we had one of the earliest sort of large-scale protesting against lockdown orders, to even now we're seeing in Europe, in places like Austria and Holland, the Netherlands, protests against a lot of these lockdown measures. So I think that's also in conjunction with everything that was already said, that's another factor that has to be considered when thinking about using these sort of authoritarian methods in what are traditionally democratic regimes.
Any other questions or comments? Jay.
Let's see. Okay. Got a few sort of questions for each of the 3 of you that comes from my perspective of being a professor of French literature and culture. So I must admit that I think I did read The Prince back when I was an undergraduate, but that was a long time ago. And so Dennis, I was quite struck by the use of the Gauls, because it's so surprising from the usual perspective that one might have on them. And of course, French culture has sort of, glorified them through a number of different means, nos ancêtres, les Gaulois, Asterix, and all. So I was just struck by the example. I think it just wouldn't occur to me to give any kind of positive response of Rome. And I was sort of thinking about, we've taught Augustine in our core, and you sort of get this picture of Augustine, at least frequently it's kind of suggested of this sort of word coming down from the north as he's sort of ending his last years, and you get that picture too. So those were just a couple of comments of mine that I thought you might respond to. And Lee, I was really struck with your use of war and peace. I frequently find with colleagues in history that we find common ground in the use of literature in in teaching history, using Aristotle political science, I found that really intriguing and something to pursue, and a nice way to think about working across disciplines. I know I have one course that I've had in French history where in dealing with the late 19th century, I incorporate Maupassant's Mont Oriol, which is about the founding of a spa by a Jewish entrepreneur, and it really is a way of sort of opening up these questions. And finally, Joe, I guess what struck me was thinking about you mentioned the Republic and not being able to elaborate more, and not having the time and just not elaborating. But I was just thinking about if knowledge is placed in the philosophers, what the clear message one seems to get from the Republic is that yes, they could solve the problem, but they choose not to because there's this, well, I suppose one could think about why they choose not to. So those are just a few thoughts. Maybe.
Dennis Lee, do you have anything you want to say? Let me just say, I'm getting some feedback. Jay, could you, thank you. I think that the philosophers, you're right, the philosophers don't want to go back into the cave, and no one wants to compel them to go back into the cave. So there's this kind of disconnect between wisdom and power, or knowledge and power in the Republic. It's duplicated and it's recapitulated in a number of ways. And in some sense, our sort of post-Enlightenment assumption is knowledge is power. The Platonic assumption is why, or the Platonic question is why? Why should the wise want power? Why does wisdom immediately, inform or translate into practice? And why would those who don't have wisdom ever want to be ruled by Socrates, or by the faculty of any college or university that they see in their neighborhood? I think Alex has.
Thank you all very much for your papers. Very interesting session overall. My question was for Lee. I really enjoyed thinking along with you, right, this idea of the regime analysis of text. So I'm a student of literature. I'm very interested in, kind of politics and literature. And one thing, so I'm very interested, especially in this idea of kind of applying kind of a comparative politics regime analysis to literary works, with the idea that when you look at literary study and you talk about multiple works of poetry, right? And by poetry, I mean really, any real literary work, not right, novels, weird poetry, etc. It tends to be the case that comparison is governed almost entirely by some historical consideration, right? So you have, right, the influence study. You have the, well, we're delimiting our scope of comparison simply by history, right? These people were writing about the same time, even if they didn't read each other. And I'm wondering, right, it seems to me that that's, really putting literature under the sway of history as a discipline, right? So if literature is to do something else, right, while not rejecting history as a category of thought entirely, there has to be some other governing principle. And I'm just wondering if you can say something about, right, comparative politics and what we might learn, right, those of us who study literature, from the way that comparative politics interacts with history or historicism.
I'll try. I'm not sure if I understand the question entirely. So, and I'm sorry if this probably is being dense on my part. So is the question what should be the governing principle to analyze literature or text, if not history, or is history should be one of the governing principles?
Yeah, I think specifically thinking about like comparative literary study, right? It's one thing, you know, to say, well, okay, you're a literature scholar, right? Talk about War and Peace or talk about the Brothers Karamazov, right? I can do a lot with one text, right? But I think, right, in order to kind of break out of the prism of, well, I'm just studying these individual texts that are all isolated little entities, right? I think this comparative politics framework presents something as a way of, you know, getting beyond simply, well, okay, I can talk about, you know, Russian literature because they kind of connect, right, nationally.
I see.
Right. So what's a principle, I think, from comparative politics in relation to history that you think would be useful?
Right.
Study?
Thank you for clarifying that. Sure. So, I mean, I think there's several tools within comparative, the subfield of comparative politics that you could use to compare different texts. I mean, one thing is, for example, comparative institutions would be an example. So what, you know, so how would that translate into a text? So in comparative politics, you say, okay, country A has a parliamentary system, country B has a presidential system, where the, you know, benefits and costs for each one. You could, but you could broadly put that in sort of what are, if we broadly define institutions, so what are the practices or the values and norms that govern a text, in sort of the background of characters in one text to another, right? Another aspect of comparative politics would be looking at, I mean, they play what they call basically elites and the masses, right? So you could easily translate that into a text, protagonists and secondary characters. Economics, comparative economics. So I think, I don't know if this is answering your question. Maybe I have a sense probably not. But within the subfield of comparative politics, there's certainly studies that sort of look at certain components when they analyze different regimes or different countries. And I imagine you probably could use the same sort of principle on text and how you would translate that. I suspect that's probably what happens in comparative literature, but I have no idea. How do they do it in comparative literature?
Yeah, thank you. I think that's actually quite helpful. So that gets, I think, to how I've kind of been thinking about it, right? It's like you can talk about, right, different kinds of narration, right? So, you know, unreliable narrators, right? You know, different kinds of protagonists, right? If we want to talk about, for instance, Captain Ahab and Moby Dick, right? And the kind of pride that he has, how does that relate to Achilles and the Iliad, for instance? So I've seen things like that occasionally. I think they're more rare, but they do exist. But I'm just wondering, I don't know if you've had this experience in looking at comparative politics literature, but I think, right, when we're talking about the comparison of parts, it's easy, I think, to compare parts, but to miss something in the whole that reflects on the part, right? And from what I know of Aristotle, right, Aristotle seems very attentive to getting, right, the real formal principle of some whole really certain, right? And so I'm wondering, like, what can we, in doing this kind of comparative work where we are talking about parts, right, what kind of reflection, right, is there something we can learn from politics, from political philosophy about really getting the whole of the work, right, at the same time, right, and presenting it to our readers or to the people we're lecturing to, perhaps?
Sure, I'll try to take a stab at it, but I'll certainly defer to Dennis and Joe as well. So in my paper with the four traditional subfields, the best regime, which is the realm of political theory, right? So what I argue in the paper or the essay, essentially, that's the normative claim about the text or that's within the text, and so that would be sort of the whole, as it were. And then if you took a comparative approach, so in the exercise I did in War and Peace, I said the claim of political theory is Tolstoy's philosophy of history in the second epilogue. This is the governing principle of War and Peace. And he actually says that, so we can use that. I mean, and then we can, from there, that's the whole, and then you can do the parts of comparative American, International, and see how you evaluate each one compared to the normative claim of political theory. Now, of course, that raises a question. I think in Tolstoy, because he has an epilogue and he speaks in his own voice, we can say, okay, that's the author's intent. I think it's more difficult when the author doesn't speak in the text, and then you'll have to figure out, well, what are the drafts, what are his letters, and then there's even a bigger question, which is, why should we value the author intent as a type of political theory or as a normative claim? Why not reader's response or some other event? So that's probably a broad, probably more than you wanted, probably more than the question you asked. I'd be interested to hear from my fellow panelists as well.
I have very little to add, but we'll say this, and it's something I always have to caution my students when we read Plato. Plato wrote the whole dialogue, just not the Socrates parts, or not just the Socrates parts. So you have to pay attention not just to, not assume that Plato's view is what comes out of Socrates' mouth, or in dialogues where Socrates isn't present, the Athenian stranger or the Eleatic stranger, but it's the whole drama of the dialogue. So there is that. And I do think that in some cases, as Lee has emphasized, that the principles of different forms of social, scientific, or political analysis may be very helpful in understanding and coming to grips with the larger structure of the work. So I don't see how you could appreciate, let's say, just to take one of my favorite sets of books, Lord of the Rings, without some appreciation of philosophy, of theology, and yes, even of comparative politics, because you look at the principles of the different regimes and look at how places are governed. Shire obviously is governed very differently from Gondor, and obviously very differently from Mordor. And I think it is helpful in understanding the whole of the work to bring a panoply of insights and tools to bear. Well, we're running up on our time limit. So does anyone have any final words they want to say?
I'll put in the link an article I wrote last year that may be of interest to people. Is what political science can learn from literature. Just so that I think political science has learned a lot from literature and core texts, and obviously this project is doing the reverse. So for what it's worth.
Thank you. It is in the chat if you want it. All right, I am going to declare this panel over and thank the panelists for taking time. Thank the members of the audience for taking time to spend with us and share your views with us. And I hope you will attend other sessions of this ACTC virtual conference. I invite you to join us next year in South Bend, Indiana at Notre Dame for what we hope, I'm inviting you to a place, so we expect it to be an in-person conference. Stay tuned for details about that. The conferences are usually around this time of year. We try to, I know the date's already been set, but our scheduling principle tends to be avoid Easter, avoid Orthodox Easter, avoid any major religious holiday. I guess the only one we can't avoid completely is Ramadan. But we try to avoid Passover, Easter, and Orthodox Easter so that people are not away from home on those important holidays. And we try to plan them years in advance, but that's the only one we're absolutely certain of at the moment. And I do invite you to attend and to submit a proposal for a paper at that. www.cortex.org is the website. Have a good evening, and thank you again for attending.